Anger in Afghanistan after a US soldier is said to have killed at least 16 civilians in a shooting spree. The White House says the incident won't change US policy. But will it change Afghan attitudes to Washington's attempts to stay in Afghanistan beyond 2014? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. It was allegedly an early Sunday morning rampage by an American Army staff sergeant who left his base and killed 16 nearby villagers, all of them civilians. The incident was met with anger in Afghanistan. Some are calling for a speedier US troop withdrawal. And there are demands that President Karzai reject a planned strategic pact with the US.
We're heartbroken over the loss of innocent life.
But the White House says the war strategy remains intact. President Obama says he's committed to winding down the war, quote, responsibly, and a decision on troop numbers is not anticipated before a NATO summit in Chicago in May. On Tuesday, hundreds chanted anti-American slogans in the first significant demonstration. The Taliban have said they will avenge the, quote, inhumane crime. Also on Tuesday, Taliban fighters attacked an Afghan delegation while they were visiting the site of the murders. One Afghan soldier was killed, 2 other men were wounded. The group that was targeted included 2 of President Hamid Karzai's brothers. Nonetheless, President Obama insists that the Pentagon's plans for a withdrawal are still on track.
We have a strategy that will allow us to responsibly wind down this war. We're steadily transitioning to the Afghans who are moving into the lead. And that's going to allow us to bring our troops home. Already we're scheduled to remove 23,000 troops by the end of this summer, following the 10,000 that we withdrew last year. And meanwhile, we will continue the work of devastating al-Qaeda's leadership and denying them a safe haven.
Well, earlier I spoke to Wahid Omar. He's the former spokesperson for President Karzai. He gave us more of a sense of the reaction in Kabul.
The anger this time is exceptional. This is a very exceptional incident, and pictures of the incident have been traveling hand to hand in thousands of copies. So this is going to be a difficult issue to address. I don't think you can go, President Obama or the US government can go with business as usual. There has to be some action that gives the Afghan people some comfort that this incident was dealt with and that the US government is actually a responsible government.
Doesn't Hamid Karzai kind of need the US presence until 2014, so he's unlikely to ask for an expedited withdrawal?
I'm not sure if he's going to ask for an expedited withdrawal of the Afghan troops, but of course there might be a question on the status of forces. What immunities the US soldiers who remain behind post-2014 or who stay until 2014, whether they are going to have immunity. What happens if this incident is repeated?
And what's interesting about that, though, is, of course, that famously scuppered Obama's plans for a long-term presence in Iraq. So do you think Karzai will demand no more immunity from prosecution for US troops? Won't that then scupper the status of forces, or at least rather the strategic partnership agreement, as it's called in Afghanistan, if he does so?
I hear from different sources that the question of its status of forces is now going to be the central question. If there is a strategic partnership and if it is agreed that some US forces will stay behind post-2014, what's going to be the status? What's going to be their legal status? The main question now is whether this perpetrator who carried out this massacre the day before yesterday, what's going to happen to him? And you're right in pointing the Iraq issue. In Iraq, this issue actually was very contentious and finally resulted in full withdrawal of the Americans. I don't think that's going to be demanded soon here. There will be a lot of discussions on that, and I don't see it as an impossible scenario where the Afghan government or President Karzai asks for this to be the main condition for the strategic partnership. But I don't know, maybe that's going to be the case.
Out of interest, though, do you have any details about this agreement? It's been cloaked in secrecy. The Afghan parliament doesn't seem to be having any say in it. I mean, is that right for a start? But do you have any details? How many Americans they want to stay? What, will night raids continue? Do they the immunity we've just spoken about? Who decides on the targets to kill? Do we have any details about any of this?
No, not much of that has been made public, and that is the main complaint that the parliament and other political forces in Kabul have. They're worried about the secrecy with which this partnership, which is very important for the life of this country, it is being dealt with by the government, and not much detail is being disclosed. But out of my information, of course, I have sources and I talk to people in the palace and within the government. I think they are. They have decided that they will put the issue of U.S. bases or U.S. using Afghan bases out of the strategic partnership. So what is going to be signed before May, my understanding is not going to include the question of the presence and how and in what manner that presence beyond 2014 would be. But they were talking about maybe 20,000 troops post-2014 stationed in bases jointly used by Afghans and by Americans, but it has been a long time. Maybe that has changed, but I think it's going to be, my information is that that's not going to be included in the partnership agreement that they are going to sign before the Chicago summit.
So, will the anger on Afghanistan's streets impact any future agreement between the US and Afghanistan? To discuss this and other issues, we're joined by Mark Jacobson, who's worked in Afghanistan as the Deputy NATO Senior Civilian Representative and who in this role advised General Petraeus. Masood Aziz is a former senior advisor to the Ambassador of Afghanistan in the United States. And Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaffer is a former intelligence officer with the US Army and now a senior fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies. Anthony Schaffer, first of all, then lots of discussion in Washington about the possibility of an expedited withdrawal by the US, official denials, but are you hearing that this is seriously being considered now?
Oh, absolutely, and there's two reasons for it. First, you've got to look at the long-term investment and what that really means for the mission. President Obama, for a while now, has talked about the fact he's committed to drawing troops out. I don't think that was a wise military thing to say, that we're going to do a surge and a certain date we're pulling out. He did it, it's done. We're going to have even more troops come out. So with that said, I think there's clear indication the administration wants to accelerate as quickly as possible. With that said, it would take at least a year under best circumstance to pull everything out we have there right now. I talked to a former Central Command commander who said after being there, it's going to take us a good year just to draw out carefully.
But the number that we were hearing was perhaps an extra 20,000 troops by 2013 than was originally announced, might be the number that we're looking at.
Absolutely, and I think we're looking at the reduction of headquarters staff, because obviously you don't need to have headquarters, you can do that remotely. And also some of this has to be the swap and mission, I'd like to believe. Clearly there's been this push back towards this anti-terrorism mission. For better or for worse, if you agree with the drone program, if you agree with the bin Laden way, the way it was executed, special operations forces are the key. We knew that in 03, 04. We decided to go back to conventional forces, and I think most experts that I talk to recognize this is really a special operations war.
But Mark Jacobson, what we're hearing though is that the commander of forces, Commander Allen, is against any speeded up withdrawal. In fact, is pushing back. Is that a scenario that you're hearing? Or?
Well, I think we have to be careful not to overanalyze the discrete issue of numbers. The strategy for a while has been grow the Afghan National Security Forces and then reduce the footprint of NATO forces so that Afghan National Security Forces can truly take the lead. And I think this is going to continue, as Tony has suggested, not just with the recovery of the surge, but beyond that. But more important than the numbers is what types of troops and where we pull them from, and there's going to be a very careful balance to make sure we don't pull out too many.
But on that point, though, about continuing the surge sort of philosophy, and perhaps some rift between the White House and commanders on the ground, does the White House really believe the commanders on the ground, given that most people think the surge has been an utter failure?
Right. Well, I'll address both those points. First, I don't think there's a rift between the White House and the commanders. I think what we're seeing is dialogue, discussion, and debate, which is actually what we were missing for about 8 years, beginning in 2001. What I also think we're seeing is that a bit of a misunderstanding that security is all that matters. Security is what enables you to help the Afghan government implement subnational governance, helps development to take hold, the build phase, if you will. And I think while we have been doing very well on the security side, I don't think we've been doing as well on the build phase.
And the narrative, though, that we're getting now, at least reports are coming out from those currently serving and previous service personnel, that the entire narrative is wrong. The surge failed on every level. Most recently, there was Lieutenant Colonel David Davis, the report that was leaked to Rolling Stone. An unclassified report was supposed to come out but hasn't yet. I mean, here's a snippet: an unbiased analysis of the tactical situation on the ground in Afghanistan. Even a cursory observation of key classified reports and metrics leads overwhelmingly to the conclusion that over the past 2 years during the surge, the insurgent force has gained strength, the number of attacks has increased considerably, the number of American casualties has skyrocketed, the Afghan people demonstrate a lack of faith in their government and security forces, and according to multiple sources, despite ISAF claims to the contrary, Taliban morale is so strong that most are reported to be utterly convinced they've already won. Masood Aziz, is that closer to the truth than the sort of victory narrative, or at least the narrative of an orderly withdrawal that we are getting from officials right now?
I think that's the right question to ask. I think what we need to do is take this incident and step back for a minute, because this particular incident, the horrific killing of the civilians by a soldier, really now questions all of the strategies that have been pursued by the previous administration and the current administration. And this is a time for us to review what are we doing now going forward. As much as this is going to be very hard to do, because the United States is going into a presidential campaign. So there are fundamental issues about the assumptions used in the strategies pursued in Afghanistan in the 11 years that we're talking about. That's really the critical point, because most of the strategies have been really predicated on a military solution in Afghanistan. And
despite talk of State Department surges and things.
Despite those talks, the talk is one thing, is what has actually been done. Only very recently we're talking about some other things. So there are fundamental assumptions that are flawed in the strategies pursued now. And those need to be discussed as to why they're flawed, because panicking into a quick withdrawal is not a solution. And bringing back some already flawed strategies that have been discussed in the past years is not going to be a solution
and moving
either.
forward post-2014. Tony Schaffer, there very quickly though, but this was a startling report. Does it chime in? I know you're privy to more confidential reports, national intelligence estimates and things like this. Is this what people really do believe despite their claims to the contrary?
Let me hit that very hard. Yes, absolutely. As we were just talking about, there's flawed assumptions. General McChrystal even said recently, we only have a cursory understanding of the culture we're dealing with. And that's been a fundamental problem from day one. I've been there. I've seen that problem in senior leadership's thinking. Secondly, and more importantly, I dispute the idea that everything is rosy. Danny Davis is telling the truth. Now, there's two reports that back him up completely. The national intelligence estimate that, by the way, General Clapper refuses to release based on some very political issues. I think he's trying to cover the White House on this. The NIE says we are not making sustainable progress, period. That's the assessment of the intelligence community. Now, I've not read the report. I've talked to 5 people who have. To a man, they've said the intel indicates bad things. Secondly, another top secret report done by Ambassador Crocker says because we've failed to reduce the safe havens in Pakistan, the entire strategy, the way we've implemented it, will fail. That's just the way it is.
And frankly, that was a critique even before the surge. I mean, many people predicted that. Mark Jacobson, and yet the narrative in Chicago is going to be very different, and you repeated some of it just now.
Well, again, I think there's no doubt that whether you're looking at the East and the South and the North, you're going to see some indications of success and some indications where actually things have gotten worse. I don't dispute that. But what I think
there's no indication of success in Davis's report.
Well, I think Davis has seen a particular slice. I actually take issue with what he says. And Tony may disagree with that, but I take issue with some of the things in the report. If you take a look at the progress that's been made in the Helmand River Valley in terms of not just security, but also in governance, you see areas where there is some progress. I don't doubt that there are many who are concerned about where is this going over the long term. Is this sustainable? My argument is actually, despite security, if you do not have a civilian surge, which I don't believe we've had to this point, then you will have problems with sustainability. But at Chicago, there's one other piece I'd just like to add quick. Yeah. This is going to require a renewed political commitment. We saw this at Lisbon, where there was a bit of wavering amongst the coalition, concern over where this was all headed, and then we saw a renewed political commitment. I think the incidents of the past month have actually exposed some of the fissures, the concerns over increasing Afghan animosity towards Western forces, and the concern over the lack of public support for the war.
Masood Aziz, why should there be political commitment if there seem to be no results of 10 years of struggle and indeed surges and everything else, despite the rosy pronouncements from ISAF and the US government?
I think it's very important to examine why we got here, because most of the strategy, if we are to move forward, we can't be sort of taking off the shelves the old strategies and reapplying it. It is much more fundamental than the report that we're talking about, and this meeting coming up in Chicago is very fundamental. The military strategy that's been pursued mostly, you know, we talk about an 11-year-old war, it isn't. We started in 2001 and 2002, then the United States moved and focused on Iraq for the next 6 years or so.
Right.
So really the resources were removed. What the assumptions were is that there are two assumptions that have informed the military strategy in Afghanistan. One was the lessons of the Russian invasion and their experience in Afghanistan and what they've done, and how they set up the cities and how they moved with the population. The second was the experience of General Petraeus in Iraq. He brought with him, even though he's a very smart man, he's repeatedly say that Iraq is different than Afghanistan, but in effect, that's the only thing they have pursued.
Absolutely.
The assumptions that were flawed there, they're fundamentally flawed, is the effect that perhaps we can turn the tribes around. And Iraq was different, except that Afghanistan is much more fractured. There's no leadership in the tribal areas. So I
wonder whether the assumption that you're making, though, is that occupation troops in Afghanistan can ever be a force of stability and not a force for instability.
That's exactly right. No, the issue is that it's beyond that, is that the objectives followed in Afghanistan under a military strategies, even those objectives were flawed, but the fact that the focus was solely or mostly on the military strategy was flawed. Only, what are the current strategies? One is to seek a political settlement and negotiation with the Taliban. Two is to effectuate this transition to Afghan security forces. Those are principally the two pillars. Even those today, we are only talking about training and negotiations with the Taliban only in the past year and a half. These are brand new strategies. Well, and they have fundamental assumptions and weaknesses in them as well.
Right.
So here we are sitting, fundamentally in a period of time when the entire world, not just the United States and Afghans and Pakistanis, are looking at the presence of the United States and NATO in Afghanistan, questioning the entire strategy.
Well, and we mentioned this earlier in the interview with the spokesman from Kabul, the former government spokesman from Kabul. There's a discussion about the Strategic Partnership Agreement and the Status of Forces Agreement, which I think we should move on now to, because now we've got to see what the implications are of the weekend's events and the long chain of events are to future strategy. Now, let's just remind ourselves of what these terms actually mean. Some wonder whether the killings over the weekend may threaten negotiations between Washington and Kabul for what happens after the scheduled pullout of combat troops, in inverted commas. Leaders from both governments have been trying to hammer out a so-called strategic partnership agreement for more than a year. It's supposed to be the framework for what US advisors and special forces can do once troops are pulled out in 2014. US officials claim that without them a civil war could once again erupt. Hamid Karzai could use the support for his unpopular government. However, it's clear that the US also wishes to keep a presence in an area of key strategic interest. The question then is, Tony Schaffer, is immunity, as it was in Iraq, now back in the picture? Might that, I mean, for a start, there's no real public discussion either in America or Afghanistan about numbers, number of bases and control and command and control and so forth. But now immunity's back in the picture. Might this now be a major issue?
Oh, it will, but let's remember the nature of the Karzai government, and the idea between Iraq and Afghanistan being somewhat equivalent is not accurate here. The problem is this, the Karzai government, I don't believe, will be able to sustain itself past the time we leave in force. I don't believe the Afghan army will be able to sustain it. And let's take a step back and look at how we won in 01-02. The Afghan militia forces. The tribes are very key to this, so even if you make an agreement with Kabul, does that mean people in the outlying areas are going to go along with it? And of course, we focused on 5 major areas, as did the Soviets, regarding the buildup of populated centers. And the bottom line is this, that the Taliban have established a shadow government everywhere we're not. So again, I always laugh when I hear about the transition of power to Afghan forces. Anywhere we're not, it's already been transitioned, and we just continue to pretend otherwise.
Mark
So we got to get real with what's really going on.
I'm sure you want to get into
Yeah,
that point.
I would just disagree with that because I think we've evolved in terms of our understanding of counterinsurgency a great deal, certainly since the Soviets. And I would argue as well that the partnership that NATO has with the Afghan people is true. This isn't a false partnership. This is one where Afghan forces
the secret
on every
documents
mission.
and then Davis and others say this is complete nonsense.
Well, I mean, look, you have, even on the night raids, you have Afghan partnered unit members on every single night raid. The Afghan Ministry of Defense, the Afghan Ministry of Interior, NDS, all get a vote whether or not to go ahead with the mission. And if they veto the mission, it doesn't take place. So I think there truly has been a transition. But the point on the tribal issues, in fact, ironically, the village stability operations that have been in the news recently for tragic reasons, this was exactly the type of effort that President Karzai, General McChrystal, General Petraeus, and the ambassadors
and what
all
we're
agreed
hearing,
with.
though, is there's been institutional, I have to use the word, lying on the part of General Petraeus from everyone else on these topics, and actually the metrics, and most of the metrics that we don't in the public get to see, but certainly the confidential metrics cited, show something utterly different.
I would be willing to concede many points to Davis. I'm even willing to concede different interpretations of what we're seeing on the ground. That's why counterinsurgency is called the graduate level of warfare. But to say that people are lying, I just think that impugns the type of integrity.
Forensic about going through examples.
I would agree with my friend on that point, that lying is going perhaps too far. But let's look at it from a different perspective. Any general
or blind faith. Perhaps they don't realize.
Right,
that
blind faith really is perhaps the right word. Any general involved in an enormous war theater is not going to reveal all of his secrets in public. But what's important here is that, let me just make a couple of very important points.
We only have a few more minutes left.
Counterinsurgency and this tribal, approach, and what to do with the tribes and how to protect the population, all of those strategies effectively is dead. Counterinsurgency is dead and ineffective in Afghanistan, and it has been for quite a while now. To talk about it now as a potential going forward is impossible. The military brass knows that.
So what are these 20,000 troops going to be doing after 2014?
Well,
exactly?
Okay, so you brought up two very important questions: the strategic partnership and the SOFA, and what happens after 2014. The strategic partnership is critically important. Why? It isn't just because we're just starting to talk about it 6 months ago. Is because what happens after 2014, because NATO and the United States have broadcast the fact that we're all leaving. And that's the message to the different factions and parties in Afghanistan and to Pakistan itself. So all they're doing, so they're looking at the calendar, they're seeing 2014, fine, we'll just wait. This is not an issue for us. This is why the strategic partnership is critically important. Absolutely. And in this panic mode that we are now,
right? But
about withdrawal,
but no one's really discussing how many troops will stay or what their rules of engagement will be. If 20,000 troops do stay, Anthony Schaffer, and that's something I understand that you've argued for in the past. First of all, what are they going to do? Secondly, doesn't that make negotiations with the Taliban impossible, which many believe will be necessary? And thirdly, is this really about the security of Afghanistan or simply about the U.S. strategic interests in Central Africa, Central Asia rather? And of course, I need an answer to that in 2 minutes. So I don't know how you're going to do that. But
very quickly, let me hit, in my book, Operation Dark Heart, last chapter, Path to Victory, talks about the safe havens in Pakistan, dealing with that issue directly. We haven't. But more importantly, the path to victory means a reconciliation, a Northern Ireland-style peace process where we bring people together, let the Pashtun live there, the Taliban live there. They need to be reconciled, and they're outside the process.
But with a huge U.S. presence in Afghanistan.
Okay, let me hit that real quick. All right, 20,000 troops. My proposal is special operations focused only on going after targets that we know to be Al-Qaeda. You're not going to necessarily leave the region when you think there's a threat. Well, we never do things at that small level. We're talking about 20,000, my judgment, would be focused on special operations, which is what the original mission was when we were there. When I was there in 02, we had 10,500 troops. We were actually doing the mission and not being targeted because we were focused on actually just anti-terrorism targets, not trying to push the Afghan people to make any decision about what kind of governance they had.
Mark Jacobson, you don't think very quickly that's just a recipe
I think
for
it was
a long-term instability? This is far from over.
Yeah.
It's 2014 is going to be the same story again.
2001 to 3 is a different war. War against Al-Qaeda. What we're looking at now is enabling the Afghan government to deal with an insurgency, which is going to continue beyond 2014.
It's not about Russia, it's not about China, it's not about Iran, it's not about Central Asia, it's not about anything else then?
I think that the U.S. people and the Afghan people certainly have one thing in common. If President Karzai and President Obama agreed tomorrow that, you know what, U.S. troops aren't needed there any longer, the American people and the Afghan people would be equally content to see American men and women in uniform come back to the United States, and the Afghan people would be pleased to see it. But everyone understands that there is need and value, and that is in the Afghan people's interest right now, and in the West's national security interest to make sure the Afghan government has a fighting
Sadly,
chance.
I have to stop the discussion there. Mark Jacobson, Masood Aziz, Anthony Schaffer, thank you very much. We'll revisit this again, though. And that's all from the Inside Story team in Washington, D.C. Do follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program, and we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.